My name is Sebastian Miller, and today, at 84 years old, I need to tell a story I've kept for far too long. A story about how I spent almost 30 years of my life believing a lie I myself constructed. If you're tired, if you wake up every day feeling like you've already fought a war before even getting out of bed, perhaps my story will resonate with you. I've lived in Manchester since I married Helen 62 years ago. I worked as an accountant for 45 years, raised 3 children, and built a life many would call successful. But what no one saw, not even my own family, was the invisible weight I carried on my shoulders every day, a weight that made me wake up exhausted, even after 8 hours of sleep, a weight that turned every staircase into a challenge, every conversation into a monumental effort. When I turned 60, I started to feel this fatigue. At first, I thought it was temporary. After working so long, it was natural for the body to demand its due, wasn't it? But months turned into years, and that silent exhaustion never left me. At 65, I retired, thinking rest would solve everything. It didn't. At 70, I consulted doctors who ran every possible test. The results always came back normal. They said I was healthy for my age, but I didn't feel healthy. I felt defeated. Helen tried to cheer me up. My children, Roderick, Marianne, and Julia, said I needed to embrace old age with more lightness. Everyone seemed convinced that this was simply the price of a long life, and I believed it. I convinced myself that aging was exactly this, a gradual farewell to energy, to disposition, to the will to live intensely. I accepted fatigue as an unwelcome guest who had permanently settled into my routine. After all, what else could I do? It was on a Sunday afternoon, almost a year ago, that everything began to change. Julia, my youngest daughter, had invited me for lunch at her house in the Didsbury neighborhood. I refused, as I always did. I was too tired to go out, I told her. The truth was, I was too tired to exist. She insisted, and I eventually gave in more out of guilt than desire. During lunch, while my grandchildren played in the backyard, I overheard a conversation between Julia and my son-in-law, Paul. He asked why I seemed so withdrawn, so distant. Julia replied with something that cut through me like a blade. She said that I was simply waiting for time to pass, that I had given up on living even before I needed to. Her words weren't malicious, but they carried a deep sadness. In that moment, I looked at myself through her eyes and saw a man I no longer recognized, a man who had turned life into an empty weight. I returned home that night with Julia's words echoing in my head. Helen was already asleep. I sat on the porch and began to ask questions I had never asked before. Was I really tired because I was old? Or was there something more, something I was ignoring? I started to think of my energy as a bucket, and I realized that this bucket had a hole. No matter how much I rested, the energy always escaped through invisible cracks. It was then that I decided to look for the leaks. The first crack I identified was something I called decisional debt. For years, decades perhaps, I had accumulated emotional and practical loose ends, conversations I never had with people I hurt or who hurt me, projects I started and never finished, objects I collected unnecessarily, turning my house into a storage unit of meaningless things, decisions I postponed indefinitely, always with the excuse of someday. Each of these unfinished tasks acted like a small parasite sucking my mental energy. I lived under the weight of a mental attic filled with unresolved issues, paying emotional interest every day. I started with something simple. The garage had been cluttered for over 15 years. Tools I never used, broken furniture I swore to fix, boxes of old documents I didn't even remember what they contained. I spent an entire week cleaning that space. It was exhausting, but something strange happened. With each box I donated, each object I threw away, I felt a physical relief, as if each item carried a piece of my vitality trapped within it. Then came the hardest part. I decided to face conversations I had avoided for years. I called my brother Oswald, with whom I hadn't properly spoken since the division of our parents' inheritance almost 10 years ago. It wasn't easy. He also carried grudges. But we talked, we put things in order, and at the end of the call, I felt something I didn't expect: lightness. It wasn't about who was right. It was about closing a cycle that had drained energy for an entire decade. I did the same with old colleagues, with neighbors I had fallen out with over trivialities, even with Helen. We sat together and talked about resentments we didn't even know existed. Small frustrations accumulated over decades of marriage. She cried, and so did I. But after that, I felt a gigantic weight lift from my shoulders. Then I noticed something even deeper. There were people in my life who added nothing, only drained. Friends who only appeared to complain, who relived old resentments as if they were repeating films, who dumped anxieties without ever seeking change. I believed I was being generous by listening, but in reality, I allowed my limited energy to be sucked away without return. I gradually began to distance myself from these relationships. I felt guilty at first. After all, some of these friends had been with me for decades, but I soon realized that my daily disposition clearly increased. I started to cultivate connections with people who inspired me, who had a vision for the future, who brought lightness instead of weight. My social circle diminished, but my vitality grew. It was around this time that Helen suggested I pay more attention to what I ate. I always thought I maintained a healthy diet. I didn't overdo anything. I ate everything in moderation. But my body, now more sensitive, reacted poorly to things that once seemed harmless. Processed foods, hidden sugars in industrialized products, artificial preservatives, and colorings. My body fought a constant internal battle to process all that, consuming an enormous amount of energy just to maintain balance. I decided to simplify. I started eating real food: fruits, vegetables, rice, beans, fresh meat. No packages, no ready-made meals. It was difficult at first, but a few weeks later, the mental fog that had accompanied me for years began to dissipate. My thinking became clearer, my disposition increased. I understood that part of what we call aging might just be the exhausted body fighting against inadequate fuel. But there was still something draining me, and I couldn't identify what it was. Until one night, I woke up at 3 in the morning and realized I had my tablet in my hand, endlessly scrolling through news. I did this every night. I thought it was relaxing, but in practice, my brain never rested. The blue light from the screen confused my body, as if the sun never set. My brain needed a specific nocturnal cycle to perform an internal cleansing, but I sabotaged this process every night. I decided to change. I started turning off all screens an hour before bed. I reclaimed the sunset ritual. I read paper books, talked with Helen, or simply sat in silence on the porch, watching the city lights. My sleep quality completely changed, and with it, my energy practically doubled. If this story has interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear in your life. I then discovered another leak that changed everything. For years, when I felt tired, I chose to rest even more. I thought I was saving energy, but I was completely wrong. Energy is not something that is passively stored. like money in a bank account. Energy is generated by movement. The more still I stayed, the weaker I became. I had unwittingly created a vicious cycle. It was hard to accept this. My body ached, my joints complained, my muscles seemed to have forgotten their purpose. But I decided to break the cycle. I started slowly, with just 5 minutes of walking in the morning. On the first day, I thought I wouldn't survive. On the second, it was a little less difficult. On the third, I managed to take a few more steps. Week after week, I increased it. 5 minutes became 10, then 15, until walking became an essential part of my day. The body is like a self-recharging battery, but it needs the friction of movement to generate energy. I learned that I needed to move to feel alive, not wait to feel alive to move. This discovery changed not only my physical disposition, but something much deeper. I began to feel like I had control over my life again, but the deepest drain was still hidden. And when I finally found it, everything made sense. I was trying to be the man I was at 40. I silently competed with a past version of myself that no longer existed. I spent monumental energy trying to prove my worth through productivity, appearance, strength. I refused help because I thought needing support was a sign of weakness. I lied to myself saying I could still do everything alone, when in reality I struggled against reality every day. It was Marianne, my middle daughter, who made me see this. She came to visit me one afternoon and found me trying to change a light bulb on the living room ceiling. I was on an old ladder, sweating, trembling, but determined to prove I was still capable. She asked me to come down, said she would call someone to do it, and I exploded. I yelled that I didn't need help, that I was still capable of taking care of my own house. Marianne didn't yell back. She just looked at me with a sadness that completely disarmed me. And she said something I will never forget. She said I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, that my worth wasn't in being able to change light bulbs or carry heavy boxes, that she loved me for who I was, not for what I could still do, and that it was okay to ask for help. I climbed down from that ladder and cried for the first time in years. I cried because I realized how much effort I spent trying to maintain a heavy armor I no longer needed to wear. At 84, I finally understood the strength that exists in acceptance. When I stopped fighting against my own age and started working in harmony with it, I felt immense relief. I abandoned the need to impress, to compete, to prove, and by removing that invisible armor, I discovered I could move with a lightness I hadn't felt in decades. But something was still missing. There was still an emptiness that all these repairs didn't completely fill. I then realized the biggest leak of all. When I retired, I left behind not only work, but also any sense of purpose. Without goals, without objectives, without a reason to wake up with enthusiasm, my brain began to shut down. It was as if my entire body had received the message that the work was done, that there was nothing important left to do. And without purpose, life became just an empty sequence of identical days. Boredom, I discovered, is far more draining than any effort. It corrodes from within, slowly, until nothing is left but exhaustion. It was during a casual encounter in Didsbury Square that everything changed again. I was walking in the morning when I saw an elderly gentleman sitting on a bench, clearly dejected. He was in his early 70s but looked much older. Something in his expression reminded me of myself a few months earlier. I sat next to him and we started talking. He told me he felt lost since he retired, that he no longer knew who he was without work, that he woke up every day with no reason to get out of bed. I listened to his story and realized it was my story, and I began to tell him everything I had discovered, the energy leaks, the decisions that need to be made, the relationships that need to be ended, the diet, the sleep, the movement. He listened to me with an attention I hadn't seen in a long time. And when I finished, his eyes were different. There was hope there. In that moment, I discovered my new mission. I started attending social groups, community centers. I even created a small conversation group here in the neighborhood. I shared my experience with others who, like me, thought fatigue was an inevitable destiny. And every time I saw someone recovering their vitality, I felt my own energy increase. Purpose, I finally understood, is the definitive antidote to fatigue. Today, at 84 years old, I have more vigor than I had at 60, not because I magically rejuvenated, but because I eliminated all the garbage that consumed my vitality. The mental garbage of unresolved issues, the social garbage of toxic relationships, the dietary garbage of inadequate fuel, the digital garbage of light that never turned off, the identity garbage of competing with who I no longer am, and the deadly absence of purpose. Helen doesn't believe it when she looks at me now. She says I've regained the sparkle in my eyes that she hadn't seen since we were young. My children comment, surprised, about my disposition. Roderick invited me to travel with him to York next month, and for the first time in years, I accepted without hesitation. Marianne asked me to teach my grandson John how to ride a bicycle, and I said yes with real enthusiasm. Julia says I've become the father she knew in childhood again, present and vibrant. I no longer see myself as a victim of the calendar. I don't count how many dawns remain for me. I focus on the quality of the step I take today, and each day has become an opportunity to live intensely, not to survive with resignation. I know that many people, especially those over 50, live under the same silent exhaustion that imprisoned me for 3 decades. They carry weights they no longer need to carry. They believe that fatigue is inevitable, a natural part of aging, but it is not. Exhaustion, most of the time, is not destiny. It is an unconscious choice. It is the leaks we allow to exist, the cracks we leave open, the drains we accept as permanent. My commitment now is to live each new dawn with my eyes wide open and my tank full. Determined to maintain what the world insists should already be lost: energy, clarity, enthusiasm for life. Not because I'm special, but because I decided to plug the holes through which my vitality was escaping. If you are reading this story and recognize in yourself this constant exhaustion, ask a simple question. Where is your leak? Is it a person who only takes and never gives? Is it a habit that drains without nourishing? Is it the lack of a purpose that makes your eyes shine in the morning? Is it the constant fight against who you no longer are? Find your leak, and then with courage and brutal honesty plug it, because I discovered something fundamental on this journey. Life doesn't end when we get old. It just becomes more expensive in terms of energy. And for that very reason, we need to learn not to waste it on what doesn't matter. Every drop of vitality we possess at 84 years old is too precious to be drained by things, people, or habits that do not make us grow. Today, I wake up every day with gratitude, not for the absence of difficulties, but for the presence of energy to face them. Not for lost youth, but for wisdom gained. Not for the time that has passed, but for the time I can still live with real intensity. At 84, I finally feel powerful, and I wish that you, wherever you are, whatever your age, also discover this power, the power to truly live with a full tank until your very last day.